Liar. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Thursday, July 14th. Oh, it's Bastille Day, isn't that right? July 14th, 2022. Time for another show. We'll have to do it entirely in French. That's all the French we know, so time to go. Always looking for an excuse to get out of doing a show, I guess. Yeah, we're back live. Yesterday, we had to go with a rerun, and I'm glad some of you enjoyed, in fact, listening to the rerun. Sometimes it brings back weird old memories. Sometimes it fills in gaps in our memory that probably would be useful for figuring out the whole January 6th thing and where the hearings are going. But I went down to D.C. to check out whether everything had been burned to the ground by Antifa and Black Lives Matter, as I had been told was the case by the people who were disputing that January 6th was a terrible, seditious insurrection against the government of the United States. And it turns out that they were totally wrong about the burning the city to the ground thing. So I'm thinking they might also be wrong about their view of January 6th as well. We will see. Greg Dworkin will be with us to catch us up on some of the latest stories. I attempted to put a finger to the pulse of the nation via the Twitter machine this morning, but apparently it broke for about an hour, or at least in my area it did. And I always wonder about that. Have I suddenly somehow been mysteriously reported for something terrible and been like shadow banned or something like that from my one indulgence in right-wing conspiracy theory fantasy? But no, Greg says it's still broken, but mine just came back on. So maybe it's coming on in sections, like when they restore the lights on the East Coast or something like that. And the whole grid goes down and it comes back up in patches. All right, well, we'll see. No, well, it says it's everywhere. Well, mine just came right back and populated again and said, there you go. And the last tweet was 8 seconds ago, allegedly, from Greg Sargent, which is, an interesting change. My last tweet before the breakage was from Armando. Well, it depends who you're following, of course. And then Greg Sargent brought us back. So, I don't know. Seems to be fine. It just brought up, you want to see another 35 tweets? I said, sure. Why not? Go ahead and say, okay. Now Greg says it's back. So, therefore, everything is fine. So maybe the patch in your neighborhood will come on in mere seconds. We're predicting. You heard it here first at Kagro in the morning, because that's who you were listening to, and everyone was talking about this. And if you had been tuned to something else, you would have heard it there first instead. All right. Very exciting. So let's see. Anything happen in the last 15 seconds or so while Twitter was on and we could find out what was going on? No, probably not. But that's why all of the news is compiled ahead of time prior to the show, and a raft of stories is in fact ready to go. Let me see what normally I have something that has just happened or what people are talking about in the morning, but of course I was cut off from that. However, we could jump back over. I have neglected to discuss the coronavirus tracker from the New York Times over the past couple of days, and I had been pleased to report, and maybe the reason I left it out was because things were on the mend here in Loudoun County. The numbers declining slightly day by day until it still hasn't dipped back down under 100 cases on average, but it was down from 140 down into the 120s and looking to go into the, maybe heading towards double digits rather than triple digits, but it's beginning to creep back up, and the news tells me that that's probably to be expected. And the new variant catching on everywhere, trendsetters everywhere catching this new virus, or new variant of the virus. Thankfully we're not dealing with an entirely new virus yet, and people are getting worried about it. People who I've seen lots of chatter on Twitter about people who have managed to avoid it for 2 years plus and suddenly saying, well, this is the variant that got me. And my having gone to D.C. yesterday has me ready to experience symptoms at any moment. But I wore my mask and did my best, and we'll see how it goes. All right, well, Greg Dworkin is here. Let's see. And, okay, I'm getting texts from my son who's driving himself to the dentist today. It's a very short ride, so I don't know where he's texting from. But I guess he's already there. All right, well, Greg, good morning. How you doing?
I'm
things
fine.
Working for you
so
yet?
You should stock up on home tests and ibuprofen and hot baths.
Hot baths, too hot for a hot bath, but okay.
Well, if you get COVID and you start having aches and pains, it's not too hot.
That's true. Well, I have aches and pains all the time, but we'll see. I mean, I won't know until the test comes back positive. But so far, so good. I don't really have any reason to believe that.
Well, it's Thursday, so the pain in your neck is back.
Yeah. Ouch. It's killing me right now. Well, what news have you been able to gather without the Twitter machine at your disposal?
Yeah, it was really difficult without Twitter. I use it for a lot of things. But let's talk about merry old England. Because, we're following that closely. And I just think there's so many lessons to learn from there for us. And so currently in the race for the Conservative, for the Tory prime ministership, that is to say, Boris Johnson steps down. He's placed in the naughty room. And for the foreseeable future, until there is an election, his replacement will be a Conservative. So the Conservatives are running, and they started out with 11. Now they're down to 6. And then they'll get down to 2, and then they'll have a runoff between the 2. And this is between the Tory MPs themselves, which is fascinating. It's essentially the Senate picking who's going to be the next president, with all of the Senate factions jockeying for position. Okay. And so you have to imagine that the Senate race is between Mitt Romney,
all right,
and Jim Inhofe, and
good choice.
Right, and so and Tom Cotton, and so you have all these different factions, jockeying to see who supports who, and that's really how you have to look at this race right now. So the Spectator, which I've been following, getting all my information from, and the Guardian, really has a excellent discussion about this, which I think is well worth looking at. So the leading candidate right now, who in the end the odds makers thing won't win, is Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor.
Okay.
And an insurgent candidate who's rising in the polls and who may well win is a woman named Penny Mordaunt. And we'll go over who these players are. Rich Sunak is the Chancellor, so he's the money guy. And he's seen as a sort of a Mitt Romney center-right kind of guy. And remember, everything is relative. Like if you're looking at the U.S. Republican Party, for example, you might think that Liz Cheney is a 10 when it comes to heroes, right? And Patsy Cipollone is an 8, and some of these guys, Brad Raffensperger's an 8 or a 7, and then on the other side are the Nazis, Stephen Miller and John Eastman and Rudy Giuliani, and they're 1s. And so you look and you say, well, Liz Cheney compared to them is just wonderful, which is true. But, it's all a relative thing. And one should not forget that we disagree with every one of Liz Cheney's policies, even though, Pat Cipollone thinks that Mike Pence should get the Medal of Freedom for doing his job.
Well.
So everything is relative. Sure. So when I say Rishi Sunak is a moderate, it's relative to the other people here.
I get you. All right.
Okay. So Sunak is leading. Right now he's got 57 MP supporting him. Penny Mordaunt's in second in 38. Penny Mordaunt is a former defense secretary who also was, and this is important, the assistant in the Brexit negotiations.
All right.
So when you're breaking down who's supporting who, if you're pro-Brexit, you're going to be more toward Penny Mordaunt and not as much Rishi Sunak. And Rishi Sunak being seen as a moderate is important because, as we'll see, the people who were worried that the Conservative Party looks to Brexit are going to gravitate to Sunak as somebody that say, look, we're not completely, totally radical here. And those same people are less likely to support some of the marginal radical candidates.
I see.
Because they're afraid of having the party being, viewed as too radical. So Rishi Sunak in first with 57, Penny Mordaunt second, 38. Liz Truss, who's the foreign secretary, also seen as a conservative, is in third with 32. And then the other three candidates who probably won't make it are interesting characters. Kemi Badenoch, who is a minor minister as far as that goes. Tom Tugendhat
Ministry for Shoes.
Also is a minor figure, as seen as a conservative. And Suella Braverman in last place with 16. She's Queen's Counsel and the Attorney General for England and Wales. And the last three candidates, especially the two women, are seen very much as radicals. So keep that in mind. So we have those six running. And they're all sort of positioning themselves. And Liz Truss is running as continuity Boris.
Oh,
Liz Truss is saying, I was a foreign minister, and, just as Hillary Clinton was like an extension of Obama, I have the same policies, and you should vote for me. People who are unhappy with Boris Johnson are not going to support her.
No, I
but
guess not.
People who are in the loyalist camp, who are very upset that Johnson got kicked out,
that's Boris,
may wind up supporting Liz Truss, which is, by the way, why she's in third and not first, even though, 3 months ago, she was seen as the leading candidate. Well, Penny Mordaunt in second place. Remember, she was the assistant in the Brexit negotiations, but the Brexit negotiator, whose name is Lord Frost, had an interview on Talk TV, and Lord Frost said he has grave reservations about Penny Mordaunt becoming the prime minister. The former Brexit negotiator, who quit Boris Johnson's cabinet last year, told Julia Hartley-Brewer, to be honest, I'm quite surprised she's where she is in this race. She was my deputy, and that was notionally more than really.
Oh. Was she no help?
And so, again, you're having people who supported Johnson really upset that anybody's running against him and finding some excuse to knife them in the back. And that's why this whole thing is so interesting. So here's a piece from The Guardian, which try to lay all this out. And it's interesting because what they do is they look at a fellow named Patrick Flynn. He's a political analyst at S Markets, which is a betting exchange with as the Guardian describes it, a strong business interest in understanding the underlying dynamics of the contest to be conservative leader. And they point out he has an awfully good track record.
Okay.
Right? So this is, like following Charlie Cook. Not always right, but, knows a lot and often gets it right.
Yeah, Charlie Cook from DraftKings. All right.
Charlie Cook from Cook Politics, Cook Political Report.
Yeah, should just be a bookmaker.
So here's how, and what he's looking at to try to predict who's going to vote for whom is looking at the members of parliament themselves, who their constituencies are, and then trying to extrapolate and say, okay, people who are like these folks are likely to do the same thing. For example, members of parliament who are running under threat from the Lib Dems, or who are running because their constituencies had doubts about Brexit right now, are backing Sunak. The former chancellor has a big advantage among MPs and constituencies, where the closest rival at the last election was a Lib Dem. 19 declared supporters among that group, and the next person, Penny Mordaunt, only with 8. So those are the first and second runners right there. Not coincidentally, Sunak also has 18 supporters in Remain constituencies, with nobody else picking up more than 4. His supporters have smaller average majorities than his biggest rivals, so his supporters tend to have just barely won their election, like
I don't know. Do we have a?
There's always a landslide Joe in Connecticut you could look at and say, okay, guys like that, right? In other words, MPs in marginal seats and those who fear that the constituents will boot them out because the government's Brexit policies seem to see Rishi Sunak as their best electoral asset, even though he campaigned to leave the EU. So remember, this is only on a relative scale. On an absolute scale, these are all really conservative people. But on a relative scale, not as conservative as some of the real radicals in the party.
Okay.
The Leave supporters themselves are divided. They'll unite eventually about somebody. But whereas Sunak enjoys a big lead among Remainers, he's way back among Leave supporters. He's only in 5th place. That's one of the reasons why this particular handicapper thinks he probably won't win.
Oh, boy.
That vote is very much split with Kemi Badenoch and Suella Braverman getting 13. These are the really radical candidates. Liz Truss on 14 and Penny Mordaunt on 18. So if you're a Leave supporter, Penny Mordaunt is your choice, and that's why she's in 2nd place and making a surge.
Okay.
Those votes are very likely to ultimately be pooled for a single Brexit candidate. And both Penny Mordaunt and Liz Truss have supporters with a high average of Brexit support in their constituencies. So if you come from a very red district in the U.S., then you're likely to support a Tom Cotton rather than a Mitt Romney, is the point I'm trying to make here.
A Liz Truss or a Penny Mordaunt.
Right? Radical candidates aren't getting support of vulnerable MPs. So Kemi Badenoch and Suella Braverman, who are both movement conservatives, if you will, have both claimed that their anti-woke cultural stances
perfect.
are the best way of winning back marginal constituencies. They themselves are women of color, as they say. Tory MPs in tight races seem to disagree. 14 of Badenoch's 24 supporters enjoy majorities of more than 30%. 2 with majorities of less than 10. Likewise, 9 of Braverman supporters have very comfortable majorities, and just 3 are in close races. So neither is likely to win the leadership, but it does give an interesting sense that those on the political front lines are not interested in enthusiasm for culture wars the way they are.
Well, we don't have any British accented enthusiasms, but
enthusiasms.
We just have to do it Chicago style instead.
Okay, now here's a parallel which is difficult to see in the U.S. because our politics don't exactly work this way. Penny Mordaunt draws almost all of her support from backbenchers. That is to say, people who haven't been in government for a while.
Yeah, they are not ministers. They're just
members of parliament. Yeah. They may have a minor ministry. They're not spokespeople for their group. And those are the people supporting her.
Backbenchers, yes.
Okay. So the new people on the block who aren't necessarily tied to Boris Johnson but believe in Brexit and are fairly conservative are after her. And that's one of the reasons why the Boris Johnson loyalists have the knives out for her, and that's why Lord Frost said what he said.
Okay. Lord Frost. That can't be real either. Jeez.
Yeah.
All right.
You can imagine Lord Frost and his throne. They all should die. Well, and she's gaining momentum. After last night's vote, Sunak might appear to be in a commanding position with 88 votes against 67 for Mordaunt, 50 for Truss, 40 for Badenoch, 37 for Tom Tugendhat, who we're not even talking about, and 32 for Suella Braverman. All you need to know about Tom Tugendhat is Bret Stephens thinks he should be the next prime minister.
Oh, okay. Well,
right, so he's off.
Tugendhat.
But Flynn's projections suggest Sunak has a smaller pool from which he can draw additional votes. In other words, the Leavers may all unite around a single candidate, and that might give Penny Mordaunt a surge. So this blows a big hole in his presentation as the inevitable sensible choice and also undermines any claims he could attempt to pick his preferred rival in the membership vote by lending his support. Democrats like to do that. We'll vote in the Republican primary so we can pick the weakest candidate. So Boris Johnson did that when he was running.
Oh.
If you don't want to vote for me, vote for this other guy. Then that'll leave the two of us, and I'll, beat the crap out of him.
All right.
If you're potentially going to lose, you're not going to do that. You're not going to give up any of your votes. A YouGov poll yesterday found that Sunak would lose to every single rival still in the race among Tory members, but Penny Mordaunt would beat all of them. So, in other words, the grassroots want Mordaunt. The senior ministers want Sunak. The marginal people want Sunak, but there aren't as many marginal people as one would like to see. And so Penny Mordaunt, who's relatively conservative, but not a Boris Johnson supporter, is likely to be the next prime minister, according to this handicapper.
Okay.
Right? So things can change.
These handicappers
Televised debates can reshape the race. But if Penny Mordaunt does win, her victory will be built on the support of pro-Brexit backbenchers without deep ties to Boris Johnson, who are less focused on cultural issues than supporters of Braverman, Badenoch, or Truss. So the deeper you get in the contest, the narrower Sunak's advantage gets, said Patrick Flynn. And so that's what he thinks is going to happen. Again, this is what happens when your party falls apart and then you have all the factions fighting each other. And it's that fear that keeps a lot of the Republicans tied to Trump.
Oh, yeah, that guy. Okay, back to, right, other side of the pond.
Right.
Yeah, dynamics sometimes very similar, although we did spend an awful lot of time explaining how Boris Johnson wasn't Trump. But today's feature, how he's very much like Trump.
But the party, whenever a party fears they might lose power, they do interesting things to try to keep that power. Mm-hmm. And the factionalism here and the factionalism across the pond are not so dissimilar. And one of the things that keeps people tied together, even though it's a horrible thing and you can't imagine folks continuing to work for people you know are awful, the thing that keeps you together is, well, if I don't and we lose, I might not have any power whatsoever, and I can't have that. And so better to do this. And, I'll live with my conscience until I can't anymore.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's an approach to life.
It is an approach to life, and it's one that we see pretty constantly.
Yeah. I can't believe how much actual policymaking depends on people who have no plan other than to roll the dice and say, I don't know whether I'm going to be relevant or not. I might bet on the crazy person.
Or, as they like to say, I want to be in the mix.
Okay.
As Mark Leibovich puts it, I want to be in the mix. It's important for me to be in the mix. Why? Well, it just is.
Mixes are important.
Right. That's why I'm here, to be in the mix.
Okay. Well, very big fandom for mixes.
Right. Hi. So, again, in the U.S., of course, we look at what's happening here. One of the things that happened between the last time I was on the show Monday and now, of course, is the January 6th committee. That was a major undertaking we had on Tuesday with Patsy Baloney actually testifying. We learned that Trump absolutely positively set everything up to happen, that none of this was a coincidence. We all sort of knew this.
Yes.
But this was like, here's proof.
Oh, well, good. Let's have it.
So the Atlantic writes, and this is a bunch of folks here, a bunch of lawyers. Donald Ayers, Stuart Gerson, Dennis Aftergood. After 7 hearings held by the January 6th committee thus far this summer, doubts as to who is responsible have been resolved. The evidence is now overwhelming. Donald Trump was the driving force behind a massive criminal conspiracy to interfere with the official January 6th congressional proceeding and to defraud the U.S. of a fair election outcome. Now, you can make those, again, these are lawyers.
All right.
Interfering with the January 6th congressional proceeding and defrauding the U.S. is not seditious conspiracy.
Oh, shoot. Why not?
That's a different charge.
Oh, okay.
So in order to make the case for seditious conspiracy, you still have to show the missing link that Trump knew that the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers were going to do what they did and he was in touch with them.
To get him on that.
Yes.
Okay.
That piece is still missing, although we have one hearing to go. And that's where being a mob boss and having intermediaries, capos like Roger Stone and Rudy Giuliani run the interference for you, saves you from I didn't order him to do that.
Right.
I just let it be known that I'd be unhappy if it didn't happen and Roger Stone did it. So, go prosecute him.
Right.
I just work here. Right. And so for people who are used to RICO prosecutions of mob bosses, that's how it works.
Yeah.
So the evidence is clearer and more robust than we, as former federal prosecutors, 2 of us at DOJ in Republican administrations, thought possible before the hearings began. Oh. Trump was not just a willing beneficiary of a complex plot in which others played the most of the primary roles while in office. He himself was the principal actor in nearly all its phases, personally executing key parts of most of its elements, and aware or involved in its worst features, including the use of violence on Capitol Hill. More remarkably, he did so over vehement objections raised at every turn, even by his sycophantic and loyal hand-picked team. This was Trump's project all along. As former prosecutors, we recognize the legitimacy of concerns that electoral winners prosecuting their defeated opponents may look like something out of a banana republic, that doing so might be viewed as opening the door to prosecutorial retaliation by future presidential winners. And in the case of this former president, it might lead to civil unrest. But given the record, all those considerations must give way to the urgency of achieving a public reckoning for Donald Trump. The committee's evidence to date establishes multiple significant points for prosecutors. And if you want a comprehensive summary, you can go to Just Security's Criminal Evidence Tracker.
Okay.
So he didn't believe he genuinely won the election. His involvement in carrying out the scheme was systematic, expansive, and extraordinarily personal. The committee's previous hearing showed that in the months after the 2020 election, Trump himself tried to interfere with the state vote counting processes. There's evidence that Trump spoke with Republican Pennsylvania House Speaker Brian Cutler after he had declined repeated calls from Giuliani and Jenna Ellis. He tried persistently to obtain the help of the DOJ in creating a false public impression. Crucial to the whole plot was the unlawful scheme to pressure Mike Pence. Ample evidence has shown Trump knew that Pence couldn't properly do this. A third significant point for prosecutors is that hearings have put into sharp focus Trump's personal involvement and advanced knowledge of the dangerous circumstances surrounding January 6th. Cassidy Hutchinson, talked about the magnetometers and that he was angry that he couldn't go to Capitol Hill, even though he knew that these folks were armed.
Well,
so there's a case there.
He's bad. Yeah.
And you don't even have to include the last intimidation thing that Liz Cheney threw out there that we don't have proof yet.
Yeah, well, that one will take a while to put together, and he can slide
every
out
time
of
the
that
committee is
one.
delivered. I would remind skeptics.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm glad to see people put this case together. We'll be right back. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We are back. Let's see, the garage door is closed. I don't know if you all know that or not. But we were discussing that during the break. That's the exciting news. I had to close the garage door because there's insurgents outside, I guess. So, all right, well, you didn't really need to know that. But
well, here in Connecticut, we close the garage doors to keep the bears out.
Yeah, see? So it's a very different sort of situation. I don't think anything would wander into my garage, really. Or even people.
Well, there's always, they don't know that. They think there's garbage pails in there.
Oh, it's garbage day, so they're out there. It's a smorgasbord for them out front. But garbage probably already been picked up. They can rummage through the recycling, though, if they want to reuse any of the materials.
Yeah. Just put a sign on your trash can that just says, my neighbor has French cooking. Go there.
The bears don't read.
It tastes much better. Go.
Yeah, give it a shot. All right.
So let's talk very briefly about this interesting piece. Short. How are the Proud Boys, QAnon, and the Oath Keepers connected?
Oh,
and really, this is in the context of the January 6th attack. And researchers have discovered many of the people charged for their alleged involvement in the attack had prior connections to the extremist groups or movements. In fact, a third of them did, of those who were being prosecuted.
Murdery Trader Green did.
Right? And so it's unusual that they all come together in a big network, but that's what this rally was. So part of the theme of the Tuesday hearing was to show how Trump's tweet got everybody together. So you had Oath Keepers and Proud Boys, different groups working together in a toxic web.
It was almost as though he was trying to unite the right after saying that they were such fine people.
So take, for example, Enrique Tarrio and Stuart Rhodes. At the time of the attack, Tarrio was the leader of the Proud Boys and Rhodes was the leader of the Oath Keepers. When we look at the connections between other defendants in extremist groups, Tarrio and Rhodes are basically in the center. They're just 1 or 2 degrees away from dozens of other people charged, and 3/4 of the known extremist organizations were present on that day. The Proud Boys and Oath Keepers both had a large presence on the day of the attack and have been accused of coordinating beforehand. And what the data shows is a tangled web of connections between individuals from different groups. Not typical. Normally, these far-right groups tend to keep to themselves. They don't get together on the weekend to go bowling. But this data demonstrates how certain ideologies can bind extremist groups together, and that kind of unifying ideology can be a powerful and destructive force. And so for that reason, something happened in the Tuesday hearing, which is a little unusual. And I note this for all the people who are not having faith in the committee. A lot of folks tweeted, while Twitter was still up, and talked about the fact that, the committee's taking a risk because for some reason they seem to want to have MAGA people testify live. And you know how that could go. That could really backfire and this and that and everything else. Completely missing the point. First of all, the committee knows what it's doing and vetted these people before they testified. And secondly, they missed the point about why they were testifying. Greg Sargent writes this up and says, amid the parade of awful revelations unearthed by the House Select Committee, one area of immense culpability still needs to further be fleshed out. And as I tell you this, think about what I said about the Tory party over in merry old England and how they need to stick together, otherwise they'll be torn apart by factionalism. So Greg Sargent writes, the issue turns on this question. How is it possible so many Americans became convinced that a reversal of Donald Trump's 2020 election loss was even possible in the first place?
Okay.
What's been missing from the story has been the role of the Republican Party writ large in helping create the conditions for that belief to take hold. Think of people like Jim Jordan.
No.
And by the way, during the committee, when these guys were testifying, I kept having a flash of like Jim Jordan being on the committee. And when it's his turn to ask questions, Sir, Stephen Ayers, who was among the rioters who entered the Capitol, just an ordinary, average, everyday Ohio guy. Sir, have you ever heard of Hunter Biden?
Right, of course.
What's missing from the story has been how the role of the Republican Party writ large in helping create the conditions. Dramatic testimony from 2 former right-wing extremists help illustrate the point in a new way. What they said resembled the sort of introspection you sometimes hear from previously brainwashed, deprogrammed victims who escaped cults, like Stephen Ayers. He said he had fallen under the spell of Trump's lies about the election. He's an ordinary guy who went to the rally, went to the Capitol, he said, because Trump told him to, and then left the Capitol the moment Trump tweeted, go home.
What a strange person. But okay.
The point being made there was Trump actually was directing and orchestrating this.
At least for him. And
at least for him
presumably
and
for
many
more
people like him.
Yes.
Ayers said he came to Washington precisely because he had been convinced that Trump's lies were true. And when Ayers was asked whether he thought the election could be overturned, he said, yeah, at the time I did, because everybody was kind of like, vice president was not going to certify the election. And what's more, Ayers testified, had he known the president was being told by his own advisors there was no evidence, he might not have showed up. I might not have come down there at all. But you know who else could have told Ayers and countless others that there was no evidence? The vast bulk of mainstream Republicans who remain silent.
Right. Who said, I'm not so sure what's going on, but I'm voting to support the president.
Nobody knows. We can't know. Right. Or I'm pretty sure bad things happen. This is one Republican congressman about impeachment. I'm pretty sure bad things happen, and I'm equally sure worse things are going to come out, but I'm voting for him anyway.
Yeah. There were certainly those people
because
who said
they were
afraid
that if we don't, then the unifying principle behind the party will be exposed. And of course, my theory is that one of the biggest problems the Republican Party has right now is they are complicit, they are responsible, and as we saw, there were 10 people that were named.
Yes.
Republican congressmen who had a meeting with Trump, including Marjorie Taylor Greene, who wasn't even a congressman yet, wasn't sworn in, about what was going to go down on January 6th. Yeah. So the point is, and my point is, that Republicans would have supported the January 6th committee a lot more if they thought that it was only going to go after Trump. What they're afraid of
I see.
is it's going after them, too.
Well,
and that's what they can't stand.
What can you do? Those are the breaks. But
those are the breaks. Them's the breaks.
That's
Boris Johnson would say.
That was right. That's true. He did just say that. Oh, interesting. But yeah, that's how they sold them on opposition to the commission and they opposed the.
Yeah, if you support this, it's going to come out what you did.
Yeah,
we can't have that.
Right. Or you can't.
This isn't just the committee that's going to look at Trump. If they're looking at truth and the facts, they're going to look at you.
Yeah. Oh, well, no wonder
they're going to look at Dana Rohrabacher, whether or not he actually is paid by Russia and Trump too.
Yeah. All right. Well, now they're doing it. And
right. Another example came from Jason Van Tatenhoff.
Who's this?
Jason Van Tatenhoff, a former high-level official in the Oath Keepers, who said he left the group in 2016. That was the other guy who testified.
I see. This is the beard guy here in this picture.
Yeah, some of his members are facing prosecution for seditious conspiracy. He was asked by Jamie Raskin why Stuart Rhodes kept calling on Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act. And Van Tatenhoff said Rhodes was looking for the trigger to carry out a violent insurrection, and Trump himself kept Rhodes fully in the game by claiming the outcome could be reversed. The president was communicating, whether directly or indirectly, messaging that gave him the nod. And here again, a forceful and sustained declaration from most mainstream Republicans that the election was over, including from people like Patrick Cipollone, who believed that but didn't say it at the time when they had the chance, would not ever be reversed, whether that could have made a difference. I fear for this election cycle coming up, Van Tatenhoff testified, and for good reason. Many continue to believe these lies, which again is partly the fault of Republicans who will not unequivocally break with Trump and declare what happened disqualifying in a party leader. Again, because if they did that, then they'd have to say, well, why didn't you do that before?
Yeah, I guess now they're stuck.
Now they're stuck.
Good.
So they won't do it.
And I mean, the opportunity was certainly there. It was fair game to say, look, Trump himself is just not really the guy we want leading the party. Look, I'm still for tax cuts, and I still hate all the same people you hate. It's just Donald Trump is a real problem child, and we could get all of these things we want with someone else. So why don't we do that?
Greg Sargent says, it's the studied silence of countless elected Republicans, but also the noisy ones. Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz, for example.
Yes, right, true.
And as you mentioned, Marjorie Taylor Greene and the Republicans who asked for pardons and, so on and so forth.
I guess it's like, well, I've come to understand now what's in the box for campaign in a box. And it's very easy, and it's actually quite easy to predict where things are going to go from there. I can even get out ahead of what's in the box by just being mean and disruptive. Just follow Trump. That box is very easy to predict, and if you have to get a new box, I don't want to have to study things. I like the path to power where you say anything, and no matter how crazy it is, the Trump formula we think will work for us. It worked for him.
And I got an
anything,
example
so
for
maybe
you
I can say anything
of exactly what you're saying. The committee played a recording of Representative Debbie Lesko, Republican, Arizona.
Yeah, she's having a rough week.
Telling other GOP members on January 5th.
Is that an important date?
That she was concerned about security the next day. Here's the quote. We have, quite honestly, Trump supporters who actually believe that we're going to overturn the election. And when that doesn't happen, most likely will not happen, they're going to go nuts.
Yeah.
So the next day, Lesko votes to object to Biden's electors.
Right. Yeah. So now here they're going to go nuts. Well, maybe, yeah. So she may very well be one of those ones that's voting, hoping that when they do go nuts and they break in, that she'll be able to scream when they grab her. She'll say, "I voted for the thing you wanted. Leave me alone. Go kill them."
And so Greg Sargent says, there you have it.
Yeah.
Violence was at least in part enabled by the deranged feudal and ultimately dashed hope the election would be reversed. And Republicans were responsible for encouraging those hopes.
Yes.
Now, you can imagine
that is a good point.
That it was unanimous to vote for Biden, for example.
Yeah.
Okay, what then? There's no grounds.
Some of them would be, they would certainly go nuts, but yeah, there would be a certain faction of them saying, wait a minute, nobody's on my side? That's weird. What am I doing here? The only person who says this election was stolen was Trump. Huh.
So
I believe him, but yeah, I feel weird.
Follow-up to that thought is from Jonathan Weiler, who studies authoritarians. The January 6th hearings continued. How a pathological culture of lying tills the ground for a coup attempt. So these aren't legal proceedings. They're political, and I don't mean that as an insult. The evidence they've uncovered could result in criminal investigation, but the committee is not obligated to present the other side. It's not obligated to let Jim Jordan muddy up the waters.
Mm-hmm. The Republican side is there. They just think you're guilty, Trump.
Right. A great example of that is what Liz Cheney presented at the very end of the last hearing. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump tried to call a low-level staffer who he would normally never call. They referred that to the lawyer referred it to us, and we referred it to the Department of Justice. Mm-hmm. Now, as a lawyer friend of mine pointed out on Twitter today before it went down, that's not proof of intimidation.
Not proof.
The fact that he made the call.
Yeah.
Is there tape? Is there something? But
even without,
he's not obligated to present the other side. Donald Trump called somebody he would otherwise never call in the context of him having tried to intimidate other witnesses and in the context of a successful committee exposing what he's doing.
Yes.
In that context, from a political point of view, it's poison. Whether or not he could be prosecuted for that particular call or not.
Right. That's true. And even although that presents two different questions about whether or not they would choose to prosecute him versus whether or not it's proof. It's not proof. It's evidence. But don't.
Right. If they're going to do witness intimidation, they could throw that among the other things, including the Cassidy Hutchinson call, which was much more direct.
Yeah.
Right. Well, maybe it was a one-off. I know that. At times he tried to do it too.
Yeah, right. There could be
that. But we're only prosecuting him for the Cassidy Hutchinson call. But these others are proof of consciousness.
Yes. Now those they probably wouldn't be able to bring in, but it's
mens rea.
But here and here in a political proceeding, as he was saying, not an insult. Yes, you can discuss those. The rules of evidence don't apply. That's one thing. But the rule of logic does. And so, yeah, you can bring these things up and say this tends to establish a pattern with him. And it's how interesting, too, that the president who insists, whenever he gets caught, insists that the people who have been at his right hand throughout whatever it is he's been caught doing this time, he says, I don't know them, coffee boy at best, never heard of him, couldn't pick him out of a lineup. All right, but now you're calling these low-level staffers. Oh, yeah, but I'm entitled to call people. You don't have a tape of it. I didn't get through. Boy. He's a good friend. She's a good friend. I was just calling to catch up and reminisce about the old days, not to tamper with them.
Yeah, I invite her out to dinner because then I could eat her hamburger.
Yeah, right. The only way out of the implication or the inference that this was a witness intimidation call is to say, I did know this person and very well and personally, which is the exact opposite of the direction that he's hoping to go. If they can establish with other evidence that it was an intimidation call, then they'll say, I never heard of this person. Why'd you call them? I butt dialed them. Yeah. Anything. I don't know.
I never heard of my best friend.
Right.
Efforts by Trump supporters to debunk the evidence presented so far have themselves tended to fall apart upon the briefest inspection. You just gave a great example of that. That is proof enough of the overall integrity of the January 6th committee and its work. Contrast to Benghazi, which was nothing but smears. Oof. I mention all of this because Tuesday's hearing were just another reminder of how all-encompassing an ecosystem of contempt for the truth has become to the modern GOP. You want another example of that? It's got nothing to do with January 6th.
Yeah, all right.
There was a 10-year-old that was raped in Ohio.
Ah, yes. This was the discussion before Twitter broke. Now I remember.
What was the GOP's response? Biden said that. It's a lie. You have no proof that happens. You want to give us proof? Let's delve into her personal information, expose who she is, and let's look at the records that we're not entitled to. And if you don't give us that, we're calling you out and saying you're a liar. Yeah. Turned out it actually happened, and the guy was indicted.
Yes, and they've moved on to a new excuse as well.
And now there's a new excuse. But the point is, my immediate response is, I'm just going to tell you, even though I don't know, but what I know is that it doesn't look good for me, and therefore I'm going to tell you it's all lies.
That's right. And I think who put this so well? Irene Carmon this morning saying, I put this aside. This Ohio tragedy is, among many other things, a lesson that there is no account deemed sympathetic enough to break through to people who simply do not care about the suffering they're causing. That's a point on the abortion front. But the greater point here is instead we get denial, misdirection, or attacking those who told the story. Everything
and they don't
but
really care
reality.
about the consequences whatsoever.
Right.
The only thing is this story in furtherance of me staying in power?
Yep. Yeah.
That's it.
And it was
else.
Jim Jordan at the center of it. Again, what a garbage person this guy is. He's really unbelievable. But he put himself right
Never mind that, Hunter Biden.
Right in the middle of this story. Oh, it's all we called it a hoax. He said there's no proof of it. And then, of course, there was produced proof of it. And I think he went and deleted his tweet saying that it was a hoax, which is not an apology, but simply an effort to duck responsibility for it. But, gave everybody the opportunity to point out. Speaking of habitual performances and patterns of behavior, like calling witnesses to intimidate them even though they don't know who they are, et cetera, Jim Jordan establishing quite a track record of covering up for sexual abusers and rapists and trying to make out like there was no story behind things that are, in fact, great personal tragedies and throwing people's lives away for political gain. That's your Jim Jordan. Throw it away with his jacket. What a nice guy. All right. Well, yeah, he was a big participant in this. By the way, yes, the new right-wing take on this is that now that they've arrested a suspect in this rape, and they were pretending for a while, well, since no suspect has been arrested, it must not have happened. Sometimes they don't solve crimes right away, but they were still crimes when they happened. And apparently they got a little assist here as the newsroom fact checkers, I guess they must have called them and tried to work the refs and say, people are printing this story about this 10-year-old, yet there's no proof that anyone's been arrested for this, so shouldn't you be doing a true-false fact check on this thing? And they complied. They actually came out with it. Well, there's been no arrest. There's not much corroborating evidence, so, we'll give it a Pinocchio and a half or whatever they decided to put on it. And then, poof, someone was arrested. The jackasses like Jordan erased their tweets, and now you have fact checkers standing out there saying, update to the story. The entire story, from my perspective, has fallen apart. But it was important that I check the facts. Fact checking is important. Well, not everything is really appropriate for fact checking necessarily. I mean, you want to check to make sure you're doing the right thing, but not everything needs to be called out in a newspaper story and assigned a number of Pinocchios. You don't have the universal metric here, Glenn.
Right.
I just thought I'd mention that. Anyway, so now they've switched directions too, by the way. The Republicans have found out that the person charged with the crime, they now claim that the person, we should say, right? We should Pinocchio them, right? Let's find out if this is really true and what do any of these terms really mean. I guess they've gotten wind of the possibility, anyway, that the person arrested for the rape is as they say, an illegal immigrant.
Undocumented.
We say regular person who came from another country, basically. Right. But, okay,
But it exists, it happened.
This is what they say.
And the point is what happens to the little girl.
Yes.
What happens
No, now that's and somebody else put it on Twitter today. Say, he was an illegal immigrant. Oh my! See, we were right all along. No, you were wrong all along.
Right,
and now you're just going to be wrong about something else.
Let's move to another liar.
Yeah,
Steve Bannon.
Liar.
Jonathan Wiley talks about him, and there was a audio clip that Mother Jones released yesterday. Bannon crowed about how Trump was going to declare victory in the election, even if he was losing. Further, Bannon gleefully related Trump would stir up an absolute crap storm in the process. That's not the word he used. And all of this might result in violence and chaos, but he didn't care. It was no concern to Bannon. And that's the point, right? When people do this, they absolutely don't care about what they stir up and what the results are. It's all in furtherance of whatever their particular goal is.
Yeah. Well,
and truth just takes a backside to it.
That's why people like
that's
what's
why
in that box.
When you're doing a political presentation, it's not like they have one rule. They can lie about whatever they want. We have another rule. If we can't prove it in court, we're not even allowed to say it in a congressional committee. That's garbage.
Yeah, well, it has to be thrown out.
Right. And so the fact is that this January 6th committee actually is a wonderful example of how congressional committees can actually function and get stuff done.
Mm-hmm. Yes, a lot of people really enjoyed this format. They've been very disciplined. They had to, I would love to know the history of these things and the negotiations in setting up the format, because there must have been some deal making. We all love the fact that they're not doing the stupid, everybody gets 5 minutes to ask the same question over and over again.
There was a tiny bit of that, and I cringed when I heard it.
Okay.
On Tuesday.
Yeah.
Tiny bit of that. And said, we've all promised not to do this, but I'm just explaining why it's so important to me. I don't want to know that.
Yeah.
I really don't care.
I didn't get a chance to watch enough of the hearings to note that was
the case. Just at the very end. It was just for like 30 seconds. And it was like fingernails on a chalkboard. And the fact that they've refrained from doing that for
that's helpful.
Multiple hours, 7 hearings, and it was only for like 30 seconds. That's great.
Yeah. I'm sure they must have had those discussions because, these guys all
They did.
have
the person's saying, we were told not to really do this, but I'm doing this anyway because I think it's really important.
That is interesting.
That's only really, really short.
Well, I'm glad they kept it to a minimum. But, there was probably, deal making ahead. Well, listen, we're not going to do things this way. And the whole committee was like, what? Oh, I got on this committee. I mean, I care about this stuff, but I was going to be a star. Well, we're going to do it a different way. And every member of the committee will sort of have a different area of interest. And we'll have a hearing where you're the star, but we're just not going to do 5 minutes for everybody every hearing and waste all the time.
Right.
All right. But they had to reassure them, you'll get your star turn.
You'll get your money. Right. So Steve Bannon isn't some fringe outlier, Jonathan Weiler writes. He's among the chief strategists behind Trump's campaign in 2016. His sneering indifference to facts is characteristic of the culture that GOP elites have fomented and accommodated themselves to. It's reflected in the composition of the January 6th committee, whose only 2 Republicans have sacrificed their political careers for refusing to accept the big lie. Yeah, we again saw that key members of the Trump team, including Patsy Baloney, displayed ethical fortitude at the 11th hour. But what's been normalized in all of this is the willingness of so many to work for a pathological liar to begin with, to enable his toxic, astonishingly corrupt presidency right up until the very end, when attempting a coup was finally a bridge too far. A reminder, Pat Cipollone defended Trump during his impeachment.
Yes, that's true.
So, again, as we talked about at the very beginning, there's a spectrum, and you may put Les Cheney as a 10 and Cipollone as an 8, but that's only relative to Stephen Miller.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't. Do we not allow negative numbers in this thing?
Yeah. A relatively obscure but telling reflection is Katrina Pearson.
Mm-hmm.
We heard from her briefly because she had an exchange with Brad Parscale. Did you catch that?
I saw some texts between them.
In that exchange, Parscale rued that Trump's inflammatory rhetoric got somebody killed. And Pearson tried to make Parscale feel better by saying it wasn't really, your fault. You did what you thought was right at the time. And to paraphrase, Parscale said, yeah, but somebody got killed.
Yeah.
And it was because of the rhetoric. And Pearson said, no, it wasn't the rhetoric. And Parscale said, yeah, it was.
Yeah,
that was just so revealing.
It is. It's interesting. It makes me think that maybe that whole story about his having like a mental breakdown over the guilt of all of it was true. Like, what if he really had a conscience all of a sudden? It took him long enough, but good, maybe. And Pearson also, occupying weird ground as well, and turning out not to be among the craziest of the crazy. But again, that too is relative. If you're bringing in Rudy Giuliani and Lynn Wood and Sidney Powell, you don't have to move, toward the other side of the spectrum in order to look moderate by comparison, and that's where Katrina Pearson is.
Well, so to finish up in time for the hour and the break, that the rogues gallery of the impressively unrepentant Sidney Powell, John Eastman, and Rudy Giuliani has taken clownishness to new heights shouldn't obscure the depths of dishonesty that's long been the GOP baseline. And he writes about Senator John Kyle. In a speech on the Senate floor, Kyle denounced Planned Parenthood and said abortions are 90% of the business. And when the fact checker said that's not true, Kyle's press secretary told CNN that was not intended to be a factual statement.
Oh, yeah. That's a good example. Forgot about that.
Right? So we're just going to lie to make our point. And if you catch me on the fact, I don't care.
Yeah.
This isn't the court of law. I'm not subject to you. I don't have to
Right.
answer to you reporters.
Right.
The
To
point
some
is
extent,
the country
an old
heard
play.
me, and they're not going to understand that what you just said is true. They're going to think what I said is true because I'm a senator and you're
It got
not.
reported. There was flags behind me. I was wearing a suit. Part of that was originally a Newt Gingrich thing, although I'm sure people can trace it further back. There were certainly liars before Newt Gingrich.
Kelly
but-
Conway's alternative facts. Paul Ryan's shamelessly fraudulent budget proposals. The point he's making is the entire party are just all in on lying. They don't care. They haven't cared for years.
That's what's
And
in the
again,
box.
part of the problem for the Republican Party is the January 6th committee is getting to the truth, and that means it's exposing all the Republican lies. They hate that. They hate
Yeah.
it.
Good.
They hate it with every fiber of their being, and that's why they're fighting it tooth and
summary.
nail.
Okay.
If it were
Yes.
just getting Trump, they'd say, okay, fine, get
Yeah,
Trump.
you can have him. But yeah, they enjoy that's what's left in the candidate in the box thing. I'll come back to that again. Like, if there's no policy in it, and how enjoyable I'm sure it has been for them to get a thing that says just say whatever you want. That's the new box.
Well, if you will, this is the January 6th expose the candidate in the box committee.
Okay, I will.
And that's
seem
why
to be
they
pushing for
are
that.
so upset.
Yeah. Well, I think this tied together rather nicely. Well done, considering that we had like 30 seconds to do it, and you pushed through. Very good. You shouldn't have let me have my 5 minutes of questioning in between to steal the spotlight. I should have just let you keep
No,
going.
you kept bringing out all the important points. It was great.
Oh, all right.
Oh,
Well,
and
let me
here's an
enhance
example
things.
of what you just said.
Yeah. I don't know. It felt like that worked very well. Thank you very much for hanging in there.
Do not try this at home. This is unplanned.
Yes. I mean, we're at home. Now that I think about it, don't try. Well, I'll tell you what. Don't try it at my home. I'm busy. Go home. Do it at your house. Just hook up a microphone
Unless you
so I
want to
can hear
close the
it.
garage door, then you can come over and do that.
All right. Well, have a great weekend. We will pick this up again on Monday and talk to you again soon. All right. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Net Roots Radio. Man, there's a lot to talk about, but why don't I derail everything by talking about some personal items? Nothing, disturbing or anything. I was just telling Greg during the breaks, and now I think because we ran the rerun yesterday and the breaks were already plugged in since we used the podcast version occasionally, I wondered whether the breaks were programmed back in again today and whether you all got the fun French pop music that you usually get, if that's what you still get during the breaks, or whether you in fact got our chatter, as sometimes happens when we mess around with the breaks. But we are careful not to do things like call out the names of donors and saying that guy's I got my censoring horn. Something like that. Not that we would ever do any such thing, obviously, but there you have it. Anyway, we chatted a little bit about what was going on. Do you want to know what was going on yesterday? I mean, it really doesn't matter. It was just like a vacation day sort of thing. But among the things that would be somewhat relevant to politics in general, we were downtown just seeing some of the sights. It was all actually part of an exercise to fulfill the various requirements, or some of the various requirements of the Citizenship in the Nation merit badge for the Boy Scouts of America. And my younger son working on finishing that up, or I guess really beginning that one, finishing up everything else. But it was interesting. We were downtown, and you're supposed to go and see federal installations and monuments or national historic places, and of course there are very many in Washington. And we decided that we would be doing some of the more obscure ones. And we were downtown with time to kill. We were there for a number of reasons. But at any rate, what we were doing with our day was just sort of looking around at some of the more obscure of the monuments and thinking about who were these monuments for, and what made them worth having monuments for, these people, and how might you think of these people historically? If you don't know who they are, should we look them up and see why they have a memorial? And do you think that that's as important? And what was it like when they decided to build the memorial? Just sort of a different approach to these things, because there's a million little minor monuments, and of course, now you're going to name them, and fans of those people will say, "What do you mean minor monument? That's a major." It's a major award, what they just gave. But we noticed, for instance, in the area of the Capitol itself, very nearby. You would think, I guess, that the things closest, the monuments closest to the Capitol, or very nearly on Capitol grounds, sort of have a place of prominence there, or perhaps other certain sites. But some things are sprinkled around the city, and they're all over the place, and there's no particular meaning that I can discern. I'm sure it meant something then. I'm sure there was a site selection committee that put a great deal of thought back in 18 whatever into where they're going to place these things. But that's part of the puzzle, and it's just sort of a more interesting approach, I think, to doing this thing than to say, all right, well, we're going to go visit the Capitol and the White House. And why are these important? Well, because, I don't know, important stuff that goes on in this country gets decided there. Slightly different approach. So anyway, among the various things that we saw that were very interesting right down in the Capitol area, for one thing, the James Garfield Memorial, which has a very prominent place. And yet, looking back, I think most modern Americans probably look back and say, well, was Garfield among our more important presidents? Well, no, but that's because he didn't get a chance to do very much. Of course, he got this monument in this prominent place because he was assassinated. And, they were having a problem with the assassination of presidents just then. The problems never stopped, of course. We had further things, but, it's interesting that there's no such... I don't think there's no similar JFK memorial in Washington. And he was president for considerably longer, fresher in memory and everything. And I mean, not that there was any lack of tributes paid to JFK. A million high schools and various installations around the country renamed for Kennedy. But Garfield, got the old style thing, a bronze statue, marble pedestal, etc., right off the west front of the Capitol, in a very prominent place between the Capitol and the National Mall. Now, there's another monument there, of course, which also, it was just an interesting conversation just to discuss what this was all about. As we're approaching it, I knew who it was, and I'm asking my son, now look at this. Look at this monument that we're approaching without knowing who this is. Maybe you could guess, but think about where we are. This is the most beautiful placement you could think of, one of the most prominent placements in Washington, D.C. We're now, again, at the foot of Capitol Hill on the west front. The dome, looms huge, right behind this monument. It's looking out the other direction toward the Washington Monument. The full expanse of the National Mall is in front of you. The majesty of the dome behind you. And it's an enormous thing. Not only is there a statue of this person, the statue is on a 25-foot marble pedestal. There's an enormous equestrian statue at the top. So the equestrian part tells you that there's some military angle to this, so it's a military personage as well. But it's not just the statue. This is a huge plaza filled with other statuary, all related to this. 4 lions, bronze cast lions on pedestals of their own, guarding each corner of this enormous marble plaza. And there's huge depictions of, and then when you get close, you can see this is like Civil War battle scenes, also cast in bronze. Enormously ornate and expensive, so Civil War kind of gives it away. And yeah, we're talking about the Ulysses Grant Memorial. And clearly an important person, and, if for your average history student, oh yeah, Ulysses Grant, I remember him. He was the guy, Civil War general, and then later president. I mean, he was, as presidents go, I believe he was a fairly crappy president. I don't think he was very well liked as president necessarily. But of course, huge hero from the Civil War. And I imagine at the time they decided that they were going to build this thing, he must have been regarded as the savior of the nation. Lincoln, certainly, and he had been assassinated. And by that time, Garfield had been assassinated as well, I guess, by the time they began work on this monument. But just very telling that, well, modern Americans say, all right, yeah, U.S. Grant, right? Very important figure, but it probably wouldn't occur to a current modern American student or citizen that that you ought to build this enormous tribute to him. And I mean, it's huge, but perhaps on reflection, it is in fact fitting. I just thought it was kind of an interesting thing. Now, meanwhile, we had also just passed the Taft. How do they say? It looks like Carillon, but there's no I, and it's a Carillon. How do you pronounce that word? I don't even actually know. I keep wanting to say Carillon, but there's, like I said, there's no I. So how do they pronounce it? Well, look, here's a pronunciation guide. You want to pump up the volume on the computer here? Carillon. Okay, there you go. So like Caroline, but bells. And now I've got the sound up. There's all sorts of things going on, making beep noises. Anyway, they have there the Taft Memorial and Carillon on the Senate side, and it's not for William Howard Taft either. It's for Senator Robert Taft, which is odd. Well, for one reason, because many people don't remember when you say Taft, you don't remember that there was Senator Robert Taft, and it's William's son, right? I think so. At any rate, very important guy in the Senate for some very crucial things in our history, etc. But the Taft Carillon is also enormous. It's not nearly as prominently placed as the Grant Memorial. And it doesn't have a big statuary, I don't think. I didn't see any, but it's a huge structure. Actually, it just sort of got me thinking, just politically speaking, like, I don't know, what must it have been like? I tweeted about it yesterday. What must it have been like to have a senator that, was so prominent and so important, and it merited something like this? Although, on Twitter, a couple people pointed out, maybe Taft didn't really merit anything like this after all. So I'd love to know the story about that, and that's part of our assignment. We'll be reading the background of the construction of some of these things. But I was just thinking, like, do you have any hope of encountering a senator like that today who, when they died, people would be like, we really need to do something about this? I mean, I know we already have an enormous Carillon over here, but there should be a second one that maybe chimes at a different time of the hour so it doesn't compete with the Taft Carillon, but there needs to be something here. I mean, this guy needs an enormous concrete construction in his honor. And I'm thinking, like, who would this even be? Can you imagine a Ted Cruz Carillon, right? The bells are made out of giant soup cans or something like that. Very personally relevant. There's nobody that merits that sort of thing, but they all think they do. The Josh Hawley Memorial, right? I don't think do you think there's ever going to be a monument to anybody like that? I don't know. I doubt it, but we don't know the full story, the full history of any of these people yet. But I mean, even if they just serve for 100 years or whatever in the Senate, will they really be missed? Will there ever become a point where, if they just keep getting elected and reelected, but doing the same things that they always did, like at some point, the fact that they've been there for 50 years, does that turn them into, do we start thinking of them differently? This guy has been distracting people from the actual important news of the day with garbage, tabloid nonsense for 50 years in the Senate. And so we're going to have a special, monument here, some sort of structure built on the passing of Josh Hawley. I doubt it, but as people pointed out, it would be interesting to sort of find out about what the decision making was like on Robert Taft too. Like, he was an important guy, but I mean, this is a really huge thing. I don't know. Maybe he left the money in his will and paid for it himself. That would be interesting to find out too. Anyway, I just thought it's a passing thought, 20 minutes worth of passing thought on that, but something to think about. And I don't know, maybe I felt like that was maybe good context for considering all of the information that Greg had provided us on the developments of the January 6th committee, and thinking about All of these people with all of these monuments, what would all of them have said about the idea of a seditious conspiracy resulting in an insurrection against the Capitol? And then can you imagine them thinking that it was normal for the United States to be sort of, wringing its hands and saying, we don't know whether we should do anything about this, because what if the proof isn't ironclad? I mean, those Civil War guys, they knew how to end those trials. I just keep coming back to the image of the hanging of the multiple suspects in the Surratt trial. We had no difficulty with this at one time. But American exceptionalism is such that we're going to debate for years whether or not it's okay to have had this insurrection, or cover up for it, or scream that it's all a hoax, or that Republicans are going to retaliate. That's something that's been stuck in pocket for a while too. I don't know. Now that reminds me, we can scroll back somewhere, but there was word not that long ago. I wonder if it's likely to turn up or not if I just scroll through. But Republicans threatening to retaliate against Democrats should they take control of the House and or Senate in the next election, that it would be their intention to, we'll subpoena the people who have been sending us all the subpoenas. I think maybe I mentioned that it was going on, maybe like at the end of one of the shows, and then it's possible that I then moved the article into the archives rather than leaving it here. But it was very interesting, just in the from the aspect from the perspective of that they were just threatening to investigate the investigators, essentially, and it presented certain problems in the first reading. But I mean, I guess they don't really care what the legal problems are. But the threat was, we will subpoena the members of the January 6th committee to find out about the real truth about how they've been rigging this thing the whole time to set us up for prosecution. And we'll just show you how easy it is to do by doing this to them, because, of course, two wrongs, as everyone knows, make a right, at least in Washington, D.C. And but it did present certain problems, like the idea that you could, if you were to subpoena the members of the January 6th committee and say, you need to come and report to us and we're going to grill you and embarrass you and try to demonstrate that you've done something wrong here. The initial problem is, why would you comply with that subpoena? Right? You're a member of Congress. You're being subpoenaed by other members of Congress. And remember, when there was good reason to subpoena members of Congress because they were a part of the seditious conspiracy, they very frequently did not agree to comply and went to court to fight this. We have yet to see how any of those things come out, but it'll be very different when they're subpoenaing former members of the committee, because if you're subpoenaing insurrectionists now, like, their best defense, members of Congress who are being subpoenaed, would be to say, well, I'm immune from having to testify under the speech and debate clause. I can't be questioned about what I did in the pursuit of congressional speech and debate. Of course, we've pointed out in the past, it says you can't be questioned about it in any other place. And this isn't any other place. It's this place. This is the one place that you can be asked. Besides which, what you were engaged in was not actual speech and debate. I won't be asking you about your vote not to certify the election, probably. Although I might be able to ask you about that because, again, this isn't any other place. But I'm talking about things that aren't part of the speech and debate, like, for one thing, planning an insurrection. That's not actual speech and debate. That's just insurrection. So there are two good reasons why you should have to answer the subpoena. I don't know whether the Supreme Court would agree, because they're insurrectionists too. But you wouldn't have that same set of facts before you if you were subpoenaing members of the committee to answer for how the committee was operating. That very clearly should fall under speech and debate because it was actually during an official proceeding and in furtherance of an official proceeding that involved no violence, by the way. Though, again, they might say, well, you don't have to answer for that in any other place. Meaning, again, we're asking you about that here. But there's this additional problem of suppose you defy that subpoena and they refer it to the Justice Department. Well, for one thing, of course, the Biden Justice Department might very well say, yeah, well, we're not going to prosecute that. That's how contempt of Congress gets prosecuted, and we have prosecutorial discretion, and we're just not going to press this case. But if they did, I suppose, then you're talking about, though, bringing them to federal court, and there you have a little bit better protection of saying, well, I was engaged in actual speech and debate during an official proceeding of the United States government that didn't rely on violence, for one thing. It was a committee hearing and a committee process. Now you're trying to make me answer questions about it in another place, in a federal court. So no, I won't be doing that. But that does leave inherent contempt open to the Republicans, and wouldn't that be remarkable if the first ones to use inherent contempt in 100 years, and the first ones to use inherent contempt power against other sitting members of Congress, or at least I suppose it could be possible they would do it against Adam Kinzinger or something like that, who's no longer a member of Congress when they charge him. But, well, if they wanted to bring that back, well, then they have to, of course, rig all the elections so that they never lose again, so that there wouldn't be any retaliation against them. Can't have that, because that's tit for tat. When we go and try and do what the Republicans have done, that's tit for tat. When Republicans do what they accuse Democrats of having done, well, that's just fair game, you see. You can see how this works. Speaking of subpoenas and compliance with, we had news the other day that the Fulton County, Georgia grand jury investigating Trump's meddling in that state's election processing and trying to intervene with Brad Raffensperger and get him to find votes so that he could be declared the winner of Georgia. That has resulted in subpoenas to Lindsey Graham and Rudy Giuliani, among others. But Lindsey Graham, of course, insisting, well, so what? I'm not going to testify, and you can't make me. And, well, there's some developments in that. Steve Bannon at the Maddow blog over at MSNBC has the news that I grabbed on it. The judge in this case, tells Lindsey Graham he must testify in the grand jury probe. Let's see what that's about. Lindsey Graham said he had no intention of honoring a subpoena from a special grand jury in Georgia. A judge has now told him he doesn't have a choice. That sounds pretty good. This dated July 12th, just 2 days ago. Probably came to my attention just after Tuesday's show. Last week, a special grand jury hearing evidence of an investigation into possible 2020 election interference in Georgia issued subpoenas to several people close to Donald Trump, including Republican Senator Lindsey Graham. Almost immediately thereafter, the South Carolinian's lawyer said Graham didn't intend to honor the subpoena, dismissing the local investigation as, quote, all politics. Yesterday, as Reuters reported, and this would have been, I guess the 11th, Monday, Reuters reported a judge took the next obvious step and told Graham he has no choice but to testify. The quote being, Fulton County Superior Court Judge Robert McBurney ordered that Graham will be required to testify on August 2nd. So put it in your calendar. The judge's certification filed on Monday described Graham as a, quote, necessary and material witness to the grand jury probe. The development was reported earlier by WSB-TV. So everybody giving credit to everybody else. It's very nice. The description of the GOP senator as a necessary and material witness is more than fair given the circumstances. As we recently discussed, It was about a week after the 2020 presidential race was called when Brad Raffensperger, Georgia's Republican Secretary of State, accused Graham of contacting him directly to question the validity of legally cast ballots. The GOP senator conceded that they had a conversation, but he called the underlying allegation ridiculous. But Raffensperger held firm, telling CNN in November of 2020 that the implication of Graham's message was, look hard and see how many ballots you could throw out. With this in mind, it was hardly a shock when the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, investigating possible election interference, said it wanted to hear Graham's side of the story. You're only reporting one side of the story. We'll come and tell your side of the story. No. As for the pushback from the senator's attorneys, Team Graham insisted last week that the Fulton County District Attorney's Office was engaged in a fishing expedition and working in concert with the January 6th committee in Washington, which is not a bad thing. Adding that if Graham cooperated, his testimony would immediately be shared with the bipartisan House Select Committee. It might be. It's not surprising this didn't persuade the local judge. He said, who cares? Circling back to our earlier coverage, it's not up to those subpoenaed by a grand jury to decide whether or not the inquiry is legitimate. Subpoenas are not casual invitations. They are legal commands. Graham may see this as a fishing expedition, but his impressions aren't especially relevant. Indeed, imagine how he'd respond if the Senate Judiciary Committee issued a subpoena only to have a relevant witness ignore it, dismissing the line of inquiry as all politics. What's more, as Graham and his legal counsel really ought to know, grand jury testimony is kept under wraps, and it would be illegal for the district attorney's office to share the information with anyone, including January 6th investigators. In other words, the South Carolina Republican and his team effectively argued that he is reluctant to honor a subpoena because he suspects local prosecutors will commit a crime. Ah, yes. Well, there is that. That's a rather outlandish accusation to make without proof in the form of a clumsy prediction. Graham's attorneys also emphasize that the senator is not a target of the investigation in Georgia, but rather simply a witness. That's a better argument. Of course, if that's true, then there's no reason for him to fight so vehemently against cooperating. Either the Republican senator has something to hide or he doesn't. Okay. At this point, Graham will be expected to testify on August 2nd, which is 3 weeks from tomorrow, which would have been on the 12th. Tomorrow would have been the 13th, so 3 weeks from yesterday. Whether and to what extent the South Carolinian intends to keep fighting against the subpoena remains to be seen. There are certainly more arguments to be had, and he could probably plead the speech and debate thing. But again, a phone call to the Georgia Secretary of State is going to be awfully hard to classify as speech and debate in Congress. It had nothing to do with what Congress was doing. He could make the argument, I was still chairman of the Judiciary Committee. I was just interested as a judiciary issue to see whether or not there needed to be hearings or investigation or legislation proposed to deal with a certain, you could make that claim and crapshoot as to whether or not anybody would believe it. Because again, you're not calling South Carolinians to ask them their opinions about that. You're calling Georgians. And you're not calling to ask them, what can we do legislatively to make sure X never happens again, whatever X may be. You're instead calling to say, hey, I think this is how you should count the votes there. And blah, 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 something, something, states' rights, sovereignty, independent state legislature, yada, 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 something. But I'm a senator from another state, a neighboring state, but another state, and this is how I think you should count the votes. Well, it's going to be awfully hard to explain. All right, that brings us to yet another break here and gives us 2 minutes to try to figure out where we will go next with this. But I thought that was important to bring up and share with you since it's a live issue at this point. Many other things happening around the country and around the world, and it'll be a big contest in my mind over the next 2 minutes or so to decide which directions to include in today's show. But we have Friday coming to us as well. That's good. Gives us a chance to round up and get a couple of these other things here. All right. Oh, by the way, I think a good encapsulation, let's say a great encapsulation of the whole thing about the 10-year-old rape victim in Ohio in the everyone's favorite Popular Information, Judd Legum's private newsletter, which is not that private and you can sign up for it, and you should. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, the same guy who was just talking to you a second ago. Our Patreon subscription drive is still going strong, with over 175 monthly donors who help keep us on the air. If we've helped keep you going during the pandemic, why not return the favor and help us keep going so we can all be together for the next disaster? Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it easy to make secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for keeping you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We literally could not do this without you. Welcome back now to the show, as I'm going to cut the announcement of which show it is short. I was scribbling notes to myself to go and look for that article that I had. I must have archived it, which means I must have mentioned it before, about Republican intentions to retaliate should they gain control of the House. Another good reason to work as hard as possible to make sure that they don't. But let's see, other items for discussion, and there are many, and there's sort of a potpourri out there. Maybe I can make Friday more of a potpourri day, but I don't know. I'm also I feel under pressure to get to some of these stories as they're still developing. But all right, well, we'll just take our chances, and then some of these things will look like we're following the news or the burgeoning interest in the news versus leading it, perhaps, if we wait until tomorrow. But okay, we're just going to have to take that risk. Let's see, other things. Oh, you know what? There was a follow-up I wanted to add to something that I had put aside here. I mentioned the other day the op-ed that ended up running in the, what was it? The Herald Tribune about from the woman who said, we should stop maligning the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers. They're really just regular, hard-working Joe dads and dedicated family men like my husband, except I don't mention that I actually am married to one of the Proud Boys. And everybody said, hey, that seems like, one, not a particularly honest op-ed to run, and two, why is there a defense being offered of the Proud Boys at all in the pages of the newspaper? I mean, these are violent. They like to actually think of themselves as violent street thugs outside of the bounds of mainstream society and politics and discourse. And why would a newspaper want to do anything or allow anybody any opportunity to defend them? The newspapers are sort of the bedrock, or they like to think of themselves as being the bedrock of civil society, where ideas and policy issues and politics are debated in staid terms, no less, and in the pages of the newspaper in print, and people will hash out their differences that way. And people who are dedicated to the whole to an idea that the whole concept of discourse being outdated and weak and stupid, and that they prefer punching people to discourse. Why would you want to defend that? I mean, that just undoes the entire premise for your existence. What's the deal? So an interesting question from that perspective, but also, of course, interesting question from the perspective of, shouldn't the writer have had to disclose this? Shouldn't an editor have vetted this and figured this out? Because it's no secret that this woman's husband is a member of the Proud Boys. She just doesn't happen to mention it. Well, A lot of issues swirling around this. And so Jeremy Littau, professor of, what does he call himself? Is he a media sociologist, professor at Lehigh University, which is always a tragedy, but there it is. At any rate, big fan of Jeremy's, nonetheless. And, these things happen. But he was tweeting about this the other day and writing about it and lamenting the inadequacy of the apology from the Herald Tribune editorial staff. He tweeted the other day the media apology that says after a piece was published that something didn't meet their standards, which is what they said about this thing, and then doesn't detail the process that led to the breakdown. That's very strange. To let an audience just wonder how a publication just blows through guardrails. That is a good question. And of course, he attaches the piece we're talking about, or rather, the apology that he's talking about, a piece from the editor of the Herald Tribune, I guess here, and this is we're talking about the Sarasota Herald Tribune. I was wondering about whether that is this the International Herald Tribune published by the New York Times Corporation or some other Herald Tribune. And I guess it is the Sarasota, Florida, I assume, Herald Tribune, now that I've clicked through. So Jennifer Orsi publishes this from the editors. Guest column about Proud Boys did not meet our standards. It's not a long piece, so we can read you the semi-apology here. The Herald Tribune erred Sunday in publishing a guest column by our opinion page and website, on our opinion page and website, with the headline, "Attacking Proud Boys Does Disservice to Caring Parents." A guest column from June 24th had criticized the author of Sunday's column, and an editor felt it fair to give her a chance to respond. We strive to provide a broad range of views from our community, including opinions in opposition to those of our editorial board. However, the Herald Tribune opinion page will not provide a forum for support of the Proud Boys, an extremist group that promotes white nationalist views and which has been labeled as a terrorist group by 2 countries and has top members under indictment on charges of seditious conspiracy in the January 6th Capitol attack. To do so is antithetical to our values as an organization. That's actually true, and is outside of our responsibility to provide a fair forum for different points of view. Our editorial process failed to keep this column from being published, as it appeared, which did not meet our standards. We are adding additional higher-level review of the process for accepting and editing guest columns for publication. We will continue to publish varied opinions from across the political spectrum on important local issues, but this decision fell short of our standards, and we apologize to our readers. Jennifer Orsi, executive editor. Interesting, but as Jeremy sees it, not entirely adequate. One of the biggest blind spots in American journalism is the tendency to categorize things in a paradigm that treats competing worldviews as mere disagreement, which makes sense given the profession's orientation has been to cast itself as debate moderator in terms of content. What you end up with is a news strategy that fits that worldview. If policy is merely a disagreement about ideas and best courses of action, should we legislate about something or should we punch political enemies in the face and just say we're going to wing it? Well, those are just strategy decisions, I guess. If policy is merely disagreement about ideas and best courses of action, then news is the forum for debate. You cloak yourself in the marketplace of ideas and shy away from moral decisions about whom to elevate. This point of view assumes that arguments are in good faith and an attempt to get at the best ideas. It cannot comprehend that some debates are ginned up as a political strategy that specifically games journalistic objectivity. For instance, see critical race theory, or as he says, race theory, critical, just being overly dramatic about it, But when what modern objectivity really does a bad job at recognizing extremists, or what it does a bad job at is recognizing extremists. I mean, this is kind of an interesting, I don't know what made me think of this at the time, but the Proud Boys thing, I mean, like I said, they're under indictment for seditious conspiracy. They're violent. They consider themselves outside the mainstream discourse. Why would you promote them as though they were, or treat them as though they were mainstream discourse, there would at no time have been an opportunity for members of the Symbionese Liberation Army to have an op-ed explaining how it really was a great idea for them to kidnap Patty Hearst, and they were awakening. Yeah, surely they believed that this was the case, but affording them an op-ed for it, no, that wouldn't have happened, and neither should it happen for the Proud Boys. But they don't really get around to saying that. Anyway, where's Jeremy here? What modern objectivity does a bad job at is recognizing extremists, calling them that, and covering them accordingly. When they are mainstream, they become a side, that in scare quotes, worthy of ink and airtime. When that is your model, this paradigm resists the idea that the system is broken. Tax policy. What's the best substance to pave roads? What kind of traffic light system to install? The mundane everyday of government, those are the areas where we have civil disagreement and we can talk about airing different views. To treat extremists as merely having a different view takes a, well, let's use our horn here, takes a ton, you get it? Takes a ton of privilege and tone deafness. You're basically saying up front that you aren't affected by the consequences of that treatment, or worse, that you don't even see those consequences. So, if we end up with a conception that the press's role is to host debate on whether extremists who are spilling out into cities across the U.S. trying to instigate violence against marginalized people, whether they can still be good dads, well, then we're lost. It's an utter abdication of your moral charge. It shouldn't take a great deal of moral imagination to figure out how best to cover that group and give it fair, rigorous coverage in your news. You don't have to silence them, but an ounce of skepticism wouldn't hurt. I mean, the author of the piece is married to one of them. So, he continues on here, journalists as gatekeepers. You aren't a self-publishing platform for any self-serving thing someone wants to publish. You're not Facebook. It's great that they say they have standards, but what good are they if they wither so easily when someone can do this? He goes on to say, the worst part of this is I wouldn't be shocked if this was an economic situation where the paper was so starved for cheap or free content that they have developed the tendency to just publish anything someone submits, and they're loath to say no because it feels biased. Be biased. Go ahead. Be biased on the side of people who want to live without the threat of violence. That's not a bad place to be, right? It's okay for the, he says, he throws asterisks in there so he doesn't say the word Proud Boys. I guess and get picked up by Proud Boys on Twitter and then targeted. But it's okay for the Proud Boys to think you're against them because, well, they don't care a whit, and he really does use the word whit, not the other word, but they don't care a whit about preserving the just democracy news organizations say they're helping or trying to help maintain, right? They're going to complain regardless. And I mean, they might pose as saying, well, I thought you guys were all about fairness and openness to different viewpoints. Why won't you print ours? Well, if you did print it, they wouldn't say, oh, good, I'm glad that they're maintaining their integrity. They would say, ha, suckers, I think we should punch them in the face anyway. Yeah, so what do you care if the Proud Boys think that you're against them? That's a good place to be. But when you elevate neutrality as a principle over preservation of democracy as a practice, well, there's your window into why a lot of news consumers at the margins are skeptical when news people talk about the role that they play in maintaining democracy. Right? Do you really? Lead with your values. Not a dissimilar problem from what we're experiencing in some cases with police. Well, you know, we do the toughest job. We're the thin blue line. We're the ones who put our lives on the line to protect you and yours. And just a little deference, therefore, would be meat, I suppose you could say in the archaic language. And then we find out, let's not go in after a school shooter. Let's just see if he runs out of bullets at some point. Or let's just beat people up for pretty much no reason and get caught on camera doing it. And then get angry at cameras and try to legislate cameras away. Another of the random news items that was sitting on my desktop waiting for sharing with you something local here. Hint, hint. But maybe we'll throw that in there. Anyway, that's a diversion from there. But yeah, this is, if you're telling people, well, for all our faults, you might disagree with us. But remember, we're here as, guardians of democracy. And we're making the tough calls and printing the unpopular opinions because of our role in preserving democracy. Well, if you were going to, say and do that, well, like he says, lead with your principles, right? It's very difficult for you to justify your neutrality if you are, in fact, allowing your neutrality to contribute to the demise of the democracy you're supposedly upholding. So maybe keep that in mind. One other thing to add, he continues, running pieces like this or ones in the genre of, yes, that person has extremist views, but let's do pictures of him in a nice suit with nice hair, the dapper Nazi approach, right? That might feel to journalists in this paradigm as if they're complexifying, that's an interesting term, someone rather than caricaturing. And generally, I am in favor of not painting subjects in rigid binaries of good or evil, but any system should have limits. And when someone is advocating for oppression of others or the violent overthrow of the democracy that you serve, or say you serve anyway, the questions change. So, in this case, yes, by all means, do a story and shine a light on them. But if you do it merely to complexity the subject, I don't know whether that's the word he meant or whether he's using jargon. I can imagine this being journalism professor jargon. When you do it merely to complexity the subject, you lock yourself to show the nuance, right? You lock yourself into necessarily softening their profile and de-emphasizing the actions they take to hurt others. Journalism of this sort, in my view, is earnestly trying to convince people of something because it misreads intentions, hoping to show that people aren't caricatures, or perhaps the foolish notion that you can negotiate with extremists and change their minds by being fair to them. When you are dealing with extremists, though, coverage should shift to being centered on the good of your audience, not the subject. Telling consumers how they got this way. What were the signs? How do they hide in plain sight with good haircuts so that we might defeat them? Not the haircuts helping them defeat, but how they do that so that, that's why we need to learn about them. Yes, so that we can defeat them. That is an interesting point there, too. When dealing with extremists, coverage should shift to being centered on the good of your audience. You don't have to be fair to the subject. You want to be fair to the audience. After all, the subject probably doesn't subscribe to your newspaper. The audience does. And when the subscribing audience feels badly served by your work, they're going to stop subscribing. Because again, on one hand, you've got extremists trying to end democracy, and on the other, you got news consumers actively harmed by their efforts. You have to pick a side. Journalism should absolutely not ignore extremists, but it should use framing power to strengthen democracy. I should note, all this is anathema to journalistic practice that, as I was taught, but because over time, objectivity was warped into an ethic of not taking sides and whistling past the graveyard, as some of those you cover are actively working to end the democracy that enables a free press. As I said at the start of this thread, it's a big blind spot. It's not merely a question of how to gatekeep extremism. The system has trouble even naming extremism, even the type that is an existential threat to the system itself. Very interesting thread, and I'm glad I put it aside, and certainly worth thinking about how far wrong they went at this Sarasota paper, which went national with publishing this op-ed about how, well, Proud Boys and Oath Keepers are just good dads. Isn't that something? All right, let's see. So I mentioned in passing that there was a local police incident. I, thought about saving this for Friday. There will be more potpourri, of course, for Friday. But maybe you have seen this. I happened to catch on Twitter the circulation of the video, and I didn't even know it was a local thing at the time. But it turns out to have been from Fairfax County, Virginia. And all I saw was the video of, it's another police incident being recorded by another citizen, showing what the cops are doing. And the backstory for this, I have a newspaper article, or a WTOP, the news radio article, that explains everything. But what we have here is, well, maybe we'll start with the article. But what we have is video of someone videotaping the police taking a local teenager, it looks like, into custody. And once the cops realize that someone is filming them, they, of course, come out to confront the person filming them. It's not immediately obvious from the film what's going on and why they feel like the person who's being detained is being mistreated, but that's part of the background story. But it shouldn't really matter. But what ends up happening is guns are drawn on the person filming, and you can hear the screaming from the cops that, I don't know whether they legitimately believe this to be the case or whether they're just using the excuse that they know is available to them legally. But they see the person with the cell phone and they decide, for whatever reason, I don't know, conscious, unconscious, but they decide to take the approach that, oh, I think that person is holding a weapon, not a cell phone. And I guess under certain conditions you could possibly confuse the two. It is possible, but I have my doubts about this. And they begin screaming that the person needs to put down the weapon. And you can hear in the voice, who I think is another teenager, basically, one, torn between standing up for their rights, and which they have, and they are correct in their understanding of their rights, and two, the reality of the situation, which is that even if he's right and they're wrong, if it ends in a shooting and he dies, what happens? Who wins in that situation? I'm vindicated in my rights in death, but I'm still dead. So what do I do here? It's just, it's, what's going on here. But it occurred to me, like, now what's happening here is, here you are recording them and they are just pointing weapons at you and saying, put down the weapon, put down the weapon. And you begin to realize there's nothing in this video that shows that the filmer does not have a weapon. He's saying that, but there's nothing that shows that. Now you need a second person to record you while you're recording to show that the police are lying about, yelling about you having a weapon. Otherwise, they shoot you and they say, well, he had a weapon. Oh, well, it turns out to be a cell phone. Yeah, but you can understand how that could be a mistake. It's in a black case. He's holding it funny. All right, maybe, but also probably not. Anyway, I had an article about it, and, I thought maybe I can bring up, I don't know if there's any, there's very often, I'm about to play video of police threatening somebody with their guns drawn and screaming orders at them, and that very frequently means that there's profanity in it, so we'll apologize to the extent that's even necessary ahead of time. But the video being circulated here, 21 seconds of audio. Maybe I should just play that, and you'll get a sense for what some of the dynamics, and then we'll read the article behind it.
Yo, what the fuck, bro?
Oh, there you go.
Nigga, 2 feds, bro.
My goodness. All right, so, okay, I have forgotten about exactly how that led in. So apologies there, not only a little profanity, but some colloquial usage of other colorful language as well. So this is, of course, the filmer approaching, seeing the cops swarming this teenage suspect or whatever, according to the article, teenage suspect here, but trying to, just puzzled as to why so many cops, why guns out in the first place. But then here's what happens.
2 feds, bro. Why you pointing the gun on me?
Because you have a weapon.
What weapon? What weapon, huh? Bro, you look dumb, bro.
Down on your knees.
Get on the ground!
Bro, what the
Get on the
fuck?
ground!
So you see what's going on here. A lot of screaming. 2 cops now with guns. Why are you pointing a gun at me? Because of your weapon. What weapon? What weapon? You look so dumb. I don't have a weapon. Well, I don't know. Anyway, the WTOP news article about it here, I guess, explains things calmly and rationally as best they can do here. The story, why did Fairfax County Police draw guns on a juvenile recording on a smartphone? A picture may be worth 1,000 words, but police in Fairfax County, Virginia said there's more to tell about a social media video showing officers pointing guns at someone using a smartphone camera. Of course, they'll say that, but let's hear it. The voice of the person holding the phone can be heard on the video as officers ordered him to the ground. Why are you pointing a gun at me? Why are you pointing a gun at me? Very true. Fairfax County Police said the incident unfolded at a Falls Church restaurant in Arlington Boulevard around 7 p.m. Saturday. The hostess reported being threatened by several juveniles. She said one flashed what appeared to be a gun. Police said the juveniles ran when officers arrived, but two were caught. As officers questioned them, a third juvenile popped up with something in his hands. And then the cop's always afraid of that. Officers, concerned about the whereabouts of the reported gun, ordered the juvenile to the ground at gunpoint. It was then determined that he was holding a smartphone. The juveniles were released to their parents. Any incident in which the Fairfax County Police point firearms automatically prompts an internal review. Police said the matter is being investigated by a detective in the Criminal Investigative Division. Fairfax County Board of Supervisors Chairman Jeff McKay said in a statement that the internal investigation will be monitored by the county's independent police auditor, who reports directly to the Board of Supervisors. It is of paramount importance that FCPD officers follow departmental policies and procedures while also protecting the safety of all our residents and meeting the expectations of our community, McKay said. WTOP is seeking comment from the juvenile who recorded the video. That's the end of the piece there. That's as dry and two-sided, I suppose, as you could possibly get it, but just interesting. And also, just contextually thinking about what's the difference between evidence and proof, and what things have we proven and what things do we have evidence that tend to prove certain things, right? Here I'm watching this thing and just thinking, normally, in a situation like this, very frequently you see police do this and threaten people who have pulled out cell phone cameras. But they haven't, for the most part, resorted at this point to lying about it and claiming that the person has got a weapon. But now you, I guess, are supposed to understand from this report why police thought there was a weapon at all. But it sows confusion. And it's quite annoying, and I don't know, it seems like there's a lot of parallels to the January 6th situation to me. I mean, they're weaker in this case than some of the other comparisons we've made lately. But just when you have somebody with the authority to make that decision, declaring that they believe that something is a weapon, now you got some evidence that says, look, the witness said that they were threatened with what looked like a gun. This is, we believe, the group of individuals who did this. So if there is in fact a gun, it's in the possession of one of these kids, maybe, if it really existed in the first place. Of course, they might have left it behind elsewhere in between then and now, but gun's not something you want to take a terrible risk with. But I guess the question is, are police exploiting that in this situation and simply trying to get somebody to stop filming them? It doesn't really look like there's anything terrible going on with this suspect who's being detained. Not in the video, but I guess I can't tell. And who knows what happened beforehand. Sometimes you miss something important on the video and then pull out the camera a little bit later, hoping to catch whatever else goes on. But then that's a serious question. What do you do when law enforcement officers simply try and game the system and say, I'm being recorded, I know that, but I also know that the video being recorded isn't going to show whether or not this individual has got a weapon. So why don't I just shout, just as we used to shout, stop resisting, stop resisting. And then we'd be able to say, see, that's me yelling, stop resisting, Your Honor. So he must have been resisting. It's evidence that tends to prove that he was resisting. But all it really is you shouting, stop resisting. Just like shouting, put down your weapon, and you have a weapon. Doesn't really mean they actually have that weapon, but they are counting on there being evidence introduced at court that tends to prove that they thought that there was a weapon. You know. Anyway, just exploiting those weak points in the system like why I said there was a January 6th parallel, like showing up at the riot as President of the United States and saying, you need to stop protecting the Capitol and start protecting me. And I'm on my way to the floor of the House, and I have the right to do that. And so I order all of you police who are trying to stop the insurrection to stand aside and or, in fact, facilitate this insurrection. Wouldn't that have been an interesting part of any trials sorting this whole thing out afterwards? If we were really digging down deep and he had gone to the Capitol, would we have to be questioning whether there were police officers facilitating the insurrection? In fact, we really should be asking that question. I know that's not a direction that the January 6th committee is likely to take, but you may recall that there were some serious questions about the activities of some of the Capitol police officers that day that led people to believe that perhaps they were, in fact, trying to facilitate the insurrection. We'll probably never get around to that in January 6th context or the committee context, because, of course, they need for the police to be the heroes in this story right now, all of them, so that they can maximize their leverage against the participants in the insurrection. It's a complicated thing. Law enforcement officers, they're kind of weird, and we have a weird relationship with them. Maybe we can explore that tomorrow.
From netrootsradio.com, you have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Well, there's lots that'll be explored, of course, by Justice Putnam on the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy next. Let's see what he's got on tap for us. The willful blindness of Team Normal that enabled Trump's coup. More specifically, around the country, masks could return to Los Angeles as COVID surges nationwide. Stay tuned for that and more next.